Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to Anderson House here in Washington, D.C. My name is Andrew Allen, and I am the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence, fulfilling the aim of the Continental Army officers who founded the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783 to perpetuate the memory of that vast event. In addition to tonight's lecture, the Institute fulfills that aim by supporting advanced study, developing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done all of this work from its headquarters right here at Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark that was completed in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson. Tonight's lecture, a program made possible in part by a generous gift from the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, features historian David O. Stewart discussing the real miracle at Valley Forge, George Washington's political mastery. Throughout the punishing winter at Valley Forge, General George Washington preserved the Continental Army while also forging it into an effective fighting force. This achievement not only reflected military leadership, but also deft political action that allowed the commander-in-chief both to repel an attempt to supersede him and to command the congressional and national support he needed to remake the Army. Tonight, Mr. Stewart examines General Washington's masterful navigation of politics and leadership during the daunting 1777 through 1778 winter encampment. Mr. Stewart is the author of 10 books of American history and historical fiction, 2 of which are on sale back there after the talk. Just nice little plug for you there, Dave. His most recent work, George Washington, The Political Rise of America's Founding Father, has won several awards, including Best Book of 2021 from the New Jersey Society of the Cincinnati and the 2022 Colonial Dames of America Book Award. It was also a finalist for George Washington's Mount Vernon's highly regarded George Washington Book Prize. In addition to his numerous books, Mr. Stewart has also written for the Staten Island Advance, monthly Supreme Court columns for the American Bar Association Journal, the Washington Post and its Sunday magazine, and the New York Times, in addition to providing commentary for major networks such as CNN, C-SPAN, Bloomberg News, and MSNBC. Now, before I turn things over to Mr. Stewart, as always, there are a few housekeeping items for those of you joining us on Zoom this evening. Following tonight's lecture, there will be a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions for Mr. Stewart at any point during the presentation using the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you throughout. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming back to Anderson House, David O. Stewart.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and I want to extend my thanks to everybody in the audience, certainly the Zoom audience, but particularly you intrepid folks who showed up here. It's always nice to have actual people to talk to. And I'm going to say particularly hi, Andy and Ellie. I didn't see you there, so thank you for coming. What I want to talk about today is a sliver of what I put together for my study of Washington that came out a couple of years ago now, which focused on his remarkable political skills. And those were especially remarkable, I think, because he was a man with relatively little formal education. And his first entry into public life, which was as commander of the Virginia Regiment during the French and Indian War, revealed a young man with sketchy political instincts and understanding. He actually sabotaged his own career a bit at that time. In the book, I highlighted a number of episodes in his mature political career, and I view that as from the Continental Congress forward, 1774, where I felt historians have neglected how vital his political talents really were. and one of them was Valley Forge. Let me start with one of the legends of Valley Forge. And this has been painted in a variety of different ways by different artists. This legend that on Christmas Day, Washington went out into the woods by himself and prayed alone for deliverance, understanding just what a terrible fix the Continental Army was in. And that this exercise through divine providence or simply self-healing of some sort changed the hearts of the Continentals and the fate of the Republic. Now, there is no firsthand account that Washington actually did this. It is a legend. But if you are, as I am, a fan of the Jimmy Stewart movie, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, you know that when the facts contradict the legend, you print the legend. So what I'd like to do tonight is supplement the legend. The real miracle at Valley Forge, I think, was Washington's political adroitness and his maneuvering. And by political, I don't, of course, mean campaigning for votes, but in the sense of effectively operating within a situation to achieve your ends. And in this case, in Washington's case, that end was the successful prosecution of the Revolutionary War. So to set the stage, at the end of 1777, when the Continental Army goes into camp at Valley Forge, Washington had been in command of the main body of that army for 2.5 years. And it was a low point. Since Trenton and Princeton at the beginning of the year, not much good had happened for him. He had 2 principal battles early in the autumn of the year, Brandywine and Germantown. Neither went well. This is a depiction of the Germantown conflict. Both were losses. There's also the Battle of Paoli, which Americans don't like to talk about. It wasn't really quite a battle. It was closer to a nighttime ambush with elements of massacre. The Continental Army lost 300 men. The British lost 11. A more one-sided battle is hard to imagine. And in addition, the British had seized the seat of the new revolutionary government in Philadelphia. Indeed, they took it without firing a shot when General Howe tricked Washington into marching his troops in the wrong direction, at which point the British Army simply walked into Philadelphia, far from a glorious moment. Now, Washington also was facing the chronic problems of the Continental Army that lasted for all 8 years of the Revolutionary War. First of all, so many of his soldiers were on short enlistments, so there was constant turnover of troops. Poor or non-existent equipment and supplies. Poor pay for the soldiers, often none at all. Bad or non-existent food for the soldiers. And a militia that was even more unreliable than the Continental Army troops. But what made this a particularly difficult time for Washington was that the northern part of the Continental Army, which was commanded by General Horatio Gates, had just won a smashing victory at Saratoga. This is the surrender of General Burgoyne, who surrendered his entire army, 6,000 men. It was a remarkable triumph, and Gates is the hero of the moment. Now, Washington's friends like to point out all of the advantages that Gates had at this battle, and he did have many. He outnumbered the British. His troops outnumbered the British nearly 3-1. Those were the sort of numbers that even a skittish militia would gain heart from. Burgoyne's men were completely worn out by their trek down from Canada through the wilds of upstate New York. They could only travel by one path through the woods, so the Americans knew exactly where to wait for them. But it was still a smashing win, and Gates's star was very much in the ascendancy. And to be honest, at that point in time, Washington seemed a bit ineffective. Now, Washington faced three major problems that I characterize as political. These were the commander-in-chief problems. And the first is his position as commander-in-chief. A general who doesn't win is by definition vulnerable. And that is what George Washington was. The second was the state of the Army. Its morale was terribly low, desertions were rising. There was a very lively risk of mutiny. And the third and closely related problem was their supply situation was completely untenable. So why, under these circumstances, did they go into camp at Valley Forge? Well, a lot of the reason was custom. That's what 18th century armies mostly did. Not always. There were a few wintertime battles in Europe. But the notion was both sides could use a break, and they were fighting the elements, which was enough for the winter. The Continentals certainly needed a break. The British, once they got into Philadelphia, took over a bunch of private houses, snuggled in front of the fireplace, and had the chance to chase all of the American women, posed modest risk. They were not very venturesome that winter. Now, Valley Forge also was close enough to the British. Those of you who don't carry around the psychic map of the Philadelphia area, it was just 20 miles away to the northwest, that Washington and his troops could keep an eye on the British, keep a watch and respond to any initiatives by the British. But it was also far enough and high enough. There's a gentle rise as you go in that direction from Philadelphia, that the British shouldn't have been able to mount a surprise attack. Washington should learn of any movement before the British army was at his doorstep. The location had very good water resources, which is important, but it had poor roads, which is a problem for supply. And it proved to be very exposed to the elements, which in the winter is a problem as well. So the first political challenge that he faced was what is known to history as the Conway cabal. And this was an effort to supersede Washington as commander-in-chief. And there are really only three officers who were visibly involved in this cabal, although I'm quite sure there were others who were sort of fellow travelers and sympathizers. The first one there, and I apologize for this image, it is the only extant image I could find of Thomas Conway, and he looks like a character from Dickens or something, not particularly martial. He was an Irishman who had been an officer in the French army. He was a competent military man, but he was an arrogant fellow and impressed with himself. He was the least important member of the cabal, but he was the most visible member of it. And it's always seemed unfair that it's called the Conway cabal because he was the least important one, but such are the vicissitudes of history. A far more important figure was Thomas Mifflin, former quartermaster general. He was very politically influential in Pennsylvania, which is where both the British and the American armies were, where the Congress was. Although they had fled Philadelphia, they had settled in Lancaster, farther west. And Mifflin was a formidable political opponent. He was smart. He was shrewd in judging people and in operating. He would become a bit of a hair shirt to Washington for the rest of his career, and a difficult adversary. Washington treated him very carefully. As former quartermaster general, it's always surprising to me that he didn't have more negative association, because the quartermaster corps was one of the three parts of the supply system that had broken down. He had left his position saying he had health problems. The health problems were not visible to anybody else. I think he left because he knew things were breaking down and he didn't intend to be around to take the negative consequences. And the third figure, of course, was General Gates. He was not generally an active participant in the scheming. That would not have been proper, and he was a proper fellow. He was a veteran of the British Army, a professional soldier, and a fellow who was, and maybe the image gives you a sense of it, fairly low on charisma. Although he was not engaged in this scheming, he certainly knew about it, and he was not indifferent to it. And I don't mean that in a pejorative fashion. He would be as ambitious as anybody else in the world. If the commander-in-chief position were to fall to him, I'm sure he would have been pleased and done his best. Now, the plotting that was going on, and it was very quiet, it was between officers, ex-officers, and Congress, and members of Congress, came to light through a drunken disclosure by a very colorful figure, by the youthful Colonel James Wilkinson. Wilkinson was only 20 years old at the time. He had been promoted well beyond his abilities. And he was on a mission from Gates. He was an aide to Gates to carry and deliver the news of Saratoga to to the Congress, which was in itself an insult to Washington. In the organization chart of the Continental Army, Gates answered to Washington. He should have been reporting to Washington, but he didn't. He was reporting to Congress. It was a not very subtle way of saying, look at me. See, look at me. Wilkinson got drunk and made a reference with another officer to a letter that General Conway had written that was disparaging about Washington's leadership abilities. And that the person who heard this disclosure reported it to his commander, who was William Alexander. We often refer to as Lord Stirling. He had pretensions to a aristocratic title in Britain that he never got. And Stirling passed that along to Washington as a loyal subordinate. When Washington got this report, I suspect it was not a surprise. He knew enough about human nature to expect that people would see his politically weakened position and would also see Gates was the savior of the hour. It was almost inevitable that somebody would think, why don't we have Gates running the show? And his response is an interesting one, because Washington, his whole life, fought his temper. He had a titanic temper. People who saw him lose his temper would speak of it with awe. And he tried not to lose it. As a young man, I mentioned in the French and Indian War, he was not the master of his emotions. But on this occasion, he was very measured and smart. He kept his cool. And all he did was he took this report he'd gotten from Lord Stirling and he forwarded it to Conway. without any comment at all. It was his way of saying, I know what's going on. I know what you're up to. And that immediately set off alarms among the conspirators. And they realized that they had to move now. The game was up. And whether they were ready or not, they needed to try with their planning to move forward, or else they would be stuck, saddled with Washington. So they moved. Their principal move, and it was a shrewd one, I'm pretty sure it was Mifflin's idea, was to revive a bureaucratic body, the Board of War, which had been created a couple of years before when the war first started, which was superior to the commander-in-chief, but had been moribund. I mean, it had never done anything. Washington had been commander-in-chief. He'd been managing the war. But they got allies in Congress to revive it, to appoint Gates as its chair, as president of the Board of War, and they placed Mifflin on it. And then Gates and Mifflin immediately appointed Conway Inspector General of the Army so he could do investigations of just how bad a general George Washington was. Now, Washington certainly understood that Conway was the weakest figure of the three. So when Conway came to his camp at Valley Forge and insisted that he was going to conduct certain investigations, Washington told him no and just sent him away, refused to cooperate in any way. And he was superior to Conway. Who the heck was Conway after all? So he just cut that off. He had to be much more circumspect with Mifflin and Gates. And between them, they hatched a fairly remarkable plan, which was that what the American cause needed to do was invade Canada. Now, you will remember that this is December. This is not the optimum time to invade Canada. In fact, we had tried that just 2 years before, when Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold from upstate New York and Maine, respectively, invaded Canada. And it was a catastrophe. And it was this odd thing that we kept choosing the coldest months to mount these invasions. Now, it had always rankled with the Americans that the Canadians didn't join the rebellion. Canada was mostly populated at the time with French settlers. And Americans assumed that they would be eager to throw off the British yoke. So Mifflin and Gates, thinking, well, who would appeal to those French Canadians, appointed Marquis de Lafayette to lead the invasion. And then they appointed Conway to be his number two. Now, Lafayette was a boy of 21 at the time, maybe 22. But he was no fool, and he was devoted to George Washington. And he immediately refused to take the position if Conway was going to be part of it. So Conway was unable to take that position. He was replaced. So already the great plan is starting to take on water. And indeed, this one never got off the ground. Lafayette travels up to Albany, New York, where the Northern Army is supposed to be in all of its greatness. And the concept was to cross frozen Lake Champlain on sleds. They were supposed to assemble 1,000 sleds. But when Lafayette got to Albany, he found there were no sleds. In fact, there were no soldiers. There were about 300 soldiers there, most of them old men and boys. And as he wrote back with greater command of English than I would have thought he had at that point, he reported that there was a want of clothing, a want of men, a want of everything indeed to be wanted. And that was the end of the invasion of Canada. Lafayette simply turned around and came back to Valley Forge. And the idea began to gain currency in Congress and throughout the country that perhaps Gates and Mifflin were not the military geniuses that the moment required. And the Board of War immediately relapsed into its moribund state from which it would sleep out the rest of the war. So it's not a dramatic thing when the conspirators were arrested and haled before a firing squad. But Washington very deftly managed the situation so to repel this effort to replace him. But the second and third political challenges related directly to the survival of the Army, not just his personal situation. Both the state of the Army and the broken supply functions. When the Army arrived in Valley Forge, we have a number of dramatic depictions of the miseries of Valley Forge, which I will inflict on you. Valley Forge immediately became the third or fourth largest concentration of Americans in the colonies. New York was bigger, Philadelphia was larger, Boston might have been the same size. So you have this giant collection of people there, but there's no infrastructure. There is no system of supply. There's no housing. There's no medical care. There's no sanitation. So the first priority was to build huts. These are huts that the Park Service created on the model of what they had. I suspect these are better made than, and you can walk into these if you haven't been to Valley Forge, which is, it's an interesting place to go. And the soldiers didn't have enough tools to really make them well. They were supposed to build them in groups of 12 because they would have 12 soldiers in the hut. You can see this is the triple bunks they had, and there would be 4 sets of triple bunks in the soldiers' huts. So usually there was just 2 or 3 soldiers in a group, in a unit that were able to work on building the huts. And they were drafty, they were smoky, they didn't draw well, and they ended up making a lot of the soldiers sick. It's an interesting contrast with the next 2 winters of the Continental Army, which were spent in camp in Morristown, New Jersey. And I had always read how it was colder in Morristown than it had been in Valley Forge, both due to its location. Also, they were just colder winters. But nobody ever talked about how terrible the Morristown camps were. And that was because I went to Morristown to learn this. They had gotten better at building the huts, and they built better huts that didn't make the soldiers sick at the same rate. So the deaths from weather and illness were much lower. 12,000 men marched into Valley Forge. 2,000 of them died of illness, never left. Now, once they had the huts up, and they had them up in a couple of weeks because it was really cold, it was December, they needed to acquire supplies. And the supply services had 3 branches. There was the quartermaster, which is what we think of as the whole package usually of supply, but it wasn't then. The quartermaster largely was involved with transportation, getting goods from here to there, and also with equipment, guns and ammunition. For food, that came through the commissary department and the commissary general. And blankets and clothing were with the clothier general, which is a position I've always enjoyed the title of. These branches of these supply services had been created on the fly when the war began. And they had performed fitfully for 2 years, largely because of the passion of the people who were involved, the enthusiasm behind the revolution. But we're now about 3 years into the revolution, and the passion has subsided. What often happens is the talented people who made something work have gone. They've moved on to some other position. And what's left is the ninnies. And that's what we had in our supply services. They were run by incompetence. Now, Washington's most important step, I think, well, there were two, but one of his most important steps was his appointment of a new quartermaster general. And for that, he chose his best general, his best fighting general, Nathaniel Greene. Greene hated the job. He wanted to win battles. He wanted to win glory. That's why he became a soldier. I mean, he was a Quaker. It was interesting that he became a soldier, but he had no interest in managing the mule teams and making sure that something got from point A to point B. And he, in one letter to a brother, he wrote quite plaintively, "Who ever heard of a quartermaster?" But he took the job and he did an outstanding job with it. First, he had to lead foraging parties to take supplies from the farmers around the area. His foraging parties were efficient, which means they were heartless. Washington always insisted that the Army would pay for its supplies that it took from citizens, but it wasn't actual money. They would write out, the officer in charge would write out an IOU and leave it with the farmer. And 12 years later, some of those got paid. But you had to live a long time to get any money out of it. And there was great resentment in the population, but there was no alternative. Greene also reorganized the purchasing system, changed the incentive structures, and recruited new people. The next challenge for Washington was to resuscitate the Army. That involved building the morale. There were, throughout the first couple of months at Valley Forge, numerous small mutinies and rebellions by soldiers, units that refused to do any, respond to any orders, refused to go out on patrol when they were told to. These are units that went 3 days without meat, 4 days without fish, 5 days without bread. Dozens of officers resigned. They feared that their families were starving. They were not in a position to provide them when the officers weren't being paid any more than the soldiers were. Indeed, there were so many officer resignations that Washington stopped dealing with them. He just refused to accept them. And he just told the officer who wanted to resign to send it to Congress, and he forced Congress to deal with it. That was sort of smart because it forced Congress to understand just how bad morale was. I think in part, though, he did it simply because he found it so depressing to see his comrades leaving the fight. Now, the suffering at the camp was terrible. Lafayette described the soldiers' huts as scarcely gayer than dungeon cells. A Massachusetts man wrote, "I have seen the soldiers turned out in such poor condition that I could not refrain from tears. It would melt the heart of a savage to see the state we are in." There were officers who dressed solely in a blanket. There were many soldiers without shoes. Being barefoot in winter is a punishment. They would try to rig up, tie cloth around their feet, but if they had to march more than a few hundred yards, the cloth came off and they were barefoot again. It was a real crisis. Washington himself wrote movingly of what the soldiers endured. "Naked and starving as they are, we cannot enough admire the incomparable patience and fidelity of the soldiers. that they have not been excited by their sufferings to a general mutiny is remarkable. Now, Washington made a point of riding through camp every morning, looking for problems that needed to be addressed. And the ones that he could fix or arrange to have fixed right away, he would make sure were addressed immediately. Now, there were a lot of them he couldn't. But it rang a bell for me. Some of you may know a book from probably 20 or 25 years ago by a management guru, Tom Peters, which talked a lot about management by walking around. And his theory was, and his teaching is, you've got to go see what's happening. You can't rely on people to tell you. They won't tell you. It's not that they're lying, they just won't tell you. And Washington understood that. He was engaged in management by walking around. You have to see the problems for yourself. But he also was delivering a message to the soldiers, which was that he cared. He knew that the conditions were appalling. He was trying, and he would repair what he could. Now, excuse me. An important change which happened in February and March, first in February, was the arrival of Baron von Steuben. Now, I'm sure you all know that he was not actually a baron. He was a professional soldier from Prussia. He probably had risen as far as a captain's position. But he was a remarkable figure. He had a passion for good soldiering. He cared a lot about it. And he had a charismatic way of teaching. He didn't speak English. And he made that a virtue because he would lay his hands on the soldiers and touch them and show them exactly what they needed to do. And he built their confidence over, apparently the one word of English he mastered was goddamn. And he used it liberally. But he built their confidence as soldiers as they learned to drill. And he would first instructed a group of mid-level officers and sent them off then to each instruct another group. And this sort of pyramidal way got the lessons through the entire army. Indeed, he wrote the first manual of arms for the American Army. He wrote it every night in French, and one of his officers had to translate it in the morning and write it up and then distribute it. And you can still buy that, Steuben's Manual of Arms, from the Valley Forge experience. But Washington knew he needed help from beyond the camp. There weren't enough resources in that camp to make a difference. What he needed was to build bridges to Congress. That was the only visible source of power in the new nation, and Washington understood that. The historian Edmund Morgan from Harvard insisted that Washington, more than any other figure in American history, understood power and where it was. And he knew that the only legitimacy, the only sovereignty in the country was Congress. It wasn't him. He'd been hired by Congress. It wasn't the Army. The Army was just an armed rabble half the time. So he always respected Congress. He always said, whatever Congress tells me to do, I will do. But he also told them what he thought they should do. And it's important to remember that Congress in 1778 was not an impressive body. This is not the Congress of July 1776. You know, they weren't singing the good songs, but they also didn't have the shining lights like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, or Richard Henry Lee. In fact, Lee at one point writes back to one of his brothers that a few new congressional delegates have arrived, but he won't name them because nobody will know their names. It was the second string, or even the third string. And Congress only consisted of delegates chosen by the legislatures in each colony, now state. They were not elected by the people. So Congress at some level was a diplomatic body. It had no mandate from the people that you could find. Now, Congress was not sitting in Philadelphia at the time, of course, because the British were there. They were in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. They met in the courthouse there, and that's an image of the courthouse. It was not a comfortable place for them. It was small. Most of the residents spoke German and not English, so that was inconvenient. And there were no newspapers produced in Lancaster. They could get the Philadelphia newspapers a few days late, but this is a difficult position to be in when you're trying to run a war. But Washington knew that that was the American government at that moment. So he built bridges to Congress in two ways. The first, and I would say they were both of equal importance. The first was to forge a relationship with this fellow, Henry Laurens of South Carolina. He was a planter and a merchant, not a professional political figure. His son was on Washington's staff, John Laurens, which was a convenient sort of point of communication for the two of them. And during this period, the Valley Forge camp, Henry Laurens was president of Congress, which was a one-year term and chosen by the other delegates. A bit of a thankless job because many states didn't send enough delegates. They had trouble always getting a quorum. But Laurens and Washington, largely through letters to each other, formed a powerful connection. And Laurens committed himself to support Washington. He supported him against the scheming of the Conway cabal and against the many troubles that were afflicting the army. The other key thing that Washington did was he invited Congress to send a committee of delegates to Valley Forge. He wanted them to see the situation for themselves and help design the solutions. The committee in camp was appointed. Laurens, of course, played a major role in this, and it had 6 members. So it's important to keep in mind, Congress would have, I don't know, at this time, maybe 17 members present at any of their sessions, 18, maybe 19. If you take 6 of them out, you're taking a third of Congress and sending it to Valley Forge. So this was a substantial commitment by Congress to deal with the Continental Army's trouble. And when they arrived, Washington presented a report that had been prepared by Alexander Hamilton, who was on his staff. And the report did not try to cover anything up. It was not a bunch of happy talk about how things were fine. There was a light at the end of the tunnel, nothing like that. Washington invited the delegates into his world to see just how bad things were. Now, the committee was led by a person Washington had never met, a Massachusetts delegate, Francis Dana. He was a 35-year-old lawyer. Washington did know some of the other committee members, all of whom stayed at Valley Forge for 5 weeks. Gouverneur Morris, Charles Carroll of Maryland, John Harvey of Virginia, Joseph Reed of Pennsylvania. These were people he knew. But he soon won the confidence of Dana and others. And he did it through his greatest gift, which was his ability to inspire trust. If you get to the book, you'll see that as my theme in many respects. And the elements seem simple, but they're not so simple to do. The first one is listening. He was really good at shutting up and listening to other people. There's a saying that he could be silent in several languages. The second, also difficult, was candor and honesty. One of the things that I looked for and never found with Washington was an occasion where he had to retract something he had said. You know, we're so used these days to hearing that some political figure is walking back his remarks, walking back what he said. I'm tired of walking back, frankly. But Washington didn't do that. And that was largely by avoiding saying dumb things. He wrote letters later in his life to young relatives, mostly nephews, who were going into, or one was a stepson, who wanted to go into public life. And the one thing he always told them was, never speak on a public matter unless you know exactly what you think. Because if you have to take it back, you're going to look like an idiot. And he followed that rule very carefully. Now, Dana met the demands of his very difficult position. He himself rode through the camp on a daily basis to inspect conditions and was deeply moved by the soldiers' plight. The committee in camp was diligent. They went through all of the Army's records for its financial situation, for its supply functions, for its disciplinary situations, and investigated all of the failures that Washington was coping with. And each of them provided powerful testimony back to Congress that supported Washington's analysis of the crisis, and they supported the solutions he sought. Congress then adopted the changes he wanted to the commissary and the quartermaster system. And support from that committee and then from Congress ratcheted through the colonies, or the states, is probably what I should say. And I think it helped rehabilitate Washington's position. And the critical step, of course, was bringing Congress into the problem and inviting them to help build the solutions. Now, it never hurts to be lucky, and he was lucky at Valley Forge, because in mid-April, news arrived of a treaty with France. It was only a treaty of alliance. It was not yet a declaration of war, but they knew a declaration of war was coming. And this was the best news that they could possibly get. It changed everything. It made it possible that the Continentals could win. And by early May, Steuben had the troops prepared enough that they were able to perform, I'm never sure how to pronounce this, the feu de joie, possibly, at a celebration of the French alliance. This is a demonstration of rolling fire. It starts with the artillery, one cannon after another at 3-second intervals, and then each soldier fires his musket, 7,000 soldiers. And they did it 3 times. And it went off flawlessly. It was something that made the soldiers proud, made Washington proud, and made them feel like an army. And then with the warm weather, soldiers came back. There were new enlistments, there were detachments arriving from other states. When Washington led his men away from Valley Forge in June, he had 15,000 troops. And they closely resembled an army. That, at the end of the day, was the true miracle of Valley Forge. And a few days from then, when they left the Valley Forge, they fought like an army at the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey. They met British and German regulars in battle, and they held their own. The British forces included the Empire's best troops, British grenadiers, men recruited to be giants. Hessian Jaegers. And it was a brutally hot day. There may have been as many casualties due to heat stroke as to weaponry. But Washington, on horseback, as we always like to portray him, rallied his men, and they stood fast against the best troops the enemy had. He slept with his men on the battlefield that night. When he rose at dawn, the sight was one he had not seen since the liberation of Boston 2.5 years before. It was a scene of conflict that the British had abandoned. They had withdrawn to hunker down in New York. Now, some like to call this battle a draw, but I deem it an essential victory, and maybe perhaps best thought of as a political victory, because it gave heart to the soldiers, it gave heart to the nation. It was the last battle in which Washington led troops until the French and Americans won the war at Yorktown 3 years later. It solidified his position and reassured the Patriot cause that he was the right man to lead the Continental Army. Thanks very much. I'd be happy to respond to questions, comments.
Questions? It's got to be something. All right.
Sir.
You mentioned earlier that Washington was tricked on the way to Philadelphia and that he went in the wrong direction. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It was after Brandywine and Germantown, and they were, he wanted to fight another battle. Washington always wanted to fight another battle. I can't give you the actual positions of each troop, each unit, but Howe fainted in one direction. Washington took the bait, thought that was where he was going, and Howe just turned around and went into Philadelphia. Howe was between the Continentals and Philadelphia, so he had the option of doing that. And Washington was trying to interpose, and Howe was able to just go around him.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. Who actually won the Battle of Germantown, which was fought October 77 in what is today a suburb of Philadelphia, featuring 12,000 American troops, 9,000 colonial and 3,000 militia against 9,000 British soldiers? And again, who won the battle, and were the results of the battle actually reinforced the French conviction to sign the alliance treaty? Thank you.
I didn't hear the last question about the French.
Yeah. Were the results of the battle, as they transmitted to Europe, it took up took 2 months to convince the French, reinforce the French conviction to sign the alliance treaty.
Got it. It was Saratoga that persuaded the French that it was a good idea to join the Americans and form that alliance. And they were able to say, okay, you lost at Germantown and Brandywine, but you know, you can win, and with our support, you have a really good chance of winning. I'm reluctant to answer this question about Germantown when we have a Germantown scholar here. Okay. Mr. Outen was at the Brandywine field. It is General Howe was in command, And is Germantown the one where they were all, he split them into three forces? Yeah. Washington had a very complicated attack plan, which involved dividing his army into three columns to attack. And it was too complicated for his soldiers. They could not execute. And one of the columns got there so late that the British, even though they were outnumbered, and outnumbering is not that big a deal for the British because they were better soldiers, they were able to deal with each in order. Washington had a very fine engineer, a French engineer, whose name escapes me right now, who always told him, we should never fight the British if each side has the same number of men, because we will lose. We must have a substantial numerical superiority, or we must have the high ground. And at Germantown, he had neither.
Hey, Dave, you mentioned that the winters in Morristown took advantage of what was learned at Valley Forge. I was wondering about the winter before Valley Forge and why there weren't apparently lessons learned there that would have helped them at Valley Forge.
That is the winter following Princeton and Trenton. And the Continental Army is on the western shore of the Delaware River, and they have access to Philadelphia. And they have a much smaller force. You know, there's 12,000 men arrived at Valley Forge. Washington, in the winter of 76, 77, gee, if he had 4,000 men, it was a lot. He had had a lot of enlistments come up. So it was a smaller group he had to supply, and he had greater resources being able to draw on Philadelphia directly. So you're right, we don't hear about that winter as having been terrible. And I think he dispersed his men in different locations along the riverbank. So the disease that really was transmitted so virulently at Valley Forge was not so much of a factor.
David, you mentioned right here.
Yes.
Yes, David, you mentioned that General Horatio Gates was part of the Conway cabal, or likely part of the Conway cabal. What did he do during the time at Valley Forge when these congressmen was there? Because he was, I don't think he was in Saratoga then. So did he spend that winter with Washington Valley Forge? Where was he?
He was not at Valley Forge. He was in the north. But then when the Board of War was constituted in February, he comes down. I might even have been January. He comes down to Lancaster and he takes his position as president of the Board of War. So he is not commanding whatever the Northern Army is at that point. And he is not in active command of troops at that moment. And that doesn't last that long. And after Valley Forge, after the cabal is undermined, Washington sort of sends him to Siberia. I mean, he sends him to New England where there's no fighting and leaves him there. And ultimately Gates, I'm inclined to say, would prove himself a fairly loyal general. And Washington ends up, by the time you get to 1782, he is Washington's second in command when they're camped along the Hudson. And they have the unpleasantness at Newburgh that at that point, Gates has managed to rehabilitate himself.
Thanks for digesting your book into a wonderful talk.
My question is about the state governments. You mentioned that Washington had made outreach to Congress. What, if any, communications did he have with the state governments to try and gain support?
I'm sorry, your voice dropped there and I just lost
To
you.
gain support from the state governments, what efforts did he make?
Yeah, I mean, I had to, I read Washington's mail for, I don't know, 50 years. And in this period, I was struck by how much of his energy went to political stuff. A good chunk of his day was not spent dealing with officers and soldiers and military situations, but was dealing with, some councilman from some borough in Pennsylvania or some state official from Connecticut and trying to get support. They were always trying to get food from New England. New England had become a quiet part of the war. And so that was viewed as a resource, but in winter, it was difficult to get all that, get that moved far enough. So he was constantly working with them. And, he spent 10, 12-hour days on his correspondence with all of these far-flung sources. And he dealt with all the governors. And, in each state, it was a different political situation, and he had to understand the different political situation in each state. So that was an essential part of the job.
All right. We do have, and when I say a few questions from Zoom. So I'm going to try to get to as many as I can, or else we will be here pretty late tonight. The first question is, let's see here. Did John Adams play a part in Mifflin and Conway's appointments to the Board of War, and did he also play a behind-the-scenes role in the attempt to replace Washington?
I didn't see it, so I don't think so. The Massachusetts congressman, although Dana ended up as a strong supporter of Washington, other Massachusetts congressmen were not. And New Englanders generally were more skeptical of Washington. Adams, if you remember the story, claimed that he nominated Washington to be commander-in-chief in 1775 and took credit for that. But he had become less enchanted with Washington as a military leader. At this time, though, he is preparing to go to Europe. He's going to be joining Franklin in negotiating with the French. So he is not with Congress. And whatever influence he exercised behind the scenes, I didn't see much of it, and I don't think it was terribly significant.
Thank you. You mentioned a little bit about von Steuben's training of the troops. Was there any training for the cavalry? Were there enough horses to train cavalry units? Can you speak a little bit to the cavalry at Valley Forge?
I don't have an answer.
Fair enough.
You'd like to think there was, but the focus has always been on the soldiers on the battlefield, the infantry.
Sure. And to dovetail off of that, what role did the militia play at Valley Forge? How did Washington and the regulars interact with?
Yeah, the militia went home, and he was glad they went home. It was mouths he didn't have to feed. So, and that was the concept of militia. They would come fight and then they'd go home.
You mentioned Lafayette at several points throughout the presentation. Can you talk about his role at Valley Forge? How did he play into the whole miracle at Valley Forge?
Yeah, he is a fascinating figure. He was so young, so privileged. He and Washington had, and I don't mean this in a sexual way, but they had a bit of a love affair. He, everyone thought Lafayette was Washington's son. You know, he famously had no children. And Washington was devoted to Lafayette. So they were very engaged. At Valley Forge, he was the ultimate loyalist, and he did play a role in undermining the Conway cabal. I mean, he's the guy who said he wouldn't have Conway as his number 2 for this Canadian expedition. And he's the one who pulled the plug on the Canadian expedition. And I'm guessing they didn't leave tracks, but I'm guessing he and Washington talked about that and what a good idea that would be. He played an important role, and he was a strong loyalist.
Very good.
There
We-
is a question here.
So just building off that, maybe you could talk a little bit about the dynamism on Washington's staff at Valley Forge, because there was obviously Hamilton and then John Lawrence. And there was this sense, I think, of a lot of youthful exuberance and energy that probably kept Washington, I would imagine, dedicated and sort of committed.
Yes, that he had real acolytes. Hamilton was actually maybe least of an acolyte. He tended to get annoyed with Washington as much as he admired him. Lawrence definitely was a tremendous supporter. And one of them, and I'm not remembering which, it could have been Lawrence, but I don't think so. It might have been another fellow. Actually, he fought a duel with Conway after they left Valley Forge and shot him. And I'm always stunned by these Revolutionary War era wounds. He was shot in the mouth, which sounds to me like curtains, you know, that would be the end. I mean, those big old musket balls sort of tearing through your face. But Conway survived and then sailed back to Europe. So he had people who, and in the Conway cabal episode, his staff was very active in agitating around the army, passing around nasty rumors and reports about the cabalists and reinforcing Washington. And Washington didn't stop them.
Thank you. You just took 2 of my questions from Zoom. So 2 birds with 1 stone there. Thank you. One of our viewers would like to know if in your research, you found any evidence of Charles Lee being implicated or contacted or associated with this Conway cabal in any way?
No, he was a German. He was a British prisoner through the period of the cabal. He is released by the British. Well, there's a officer swap. We sent them a general, and they sent us Lee. We got the worst of the deal. Although I do have a friend who's written positively about Lee. Lee was a very strange guy, and he comes to the Army right before they leave Valley Forge. He gets there, might have been early June. Washington restores him to his former position, which is his number 2 officer. And then at the Battle of Monmouth, they have a real unhappy encounter where Washington is very unhappy with how Lee has been leading his contingent. And after the battle, Lee demands to be court-martialed to vindicate himself, which was a really dumb thing to do, because Washington would appoint the officers to preside at his court-martial, and they're going to not contradict the commander-in-chief. So Lee was convicted, and he was suspended from the Army for a year, and then ultimately he dies of disease before he could come back. The thing that stunned me about Lee when I researched this was when he was a prisoner, and even my friend who defends Lee acknowledges this, he actually prepared a multi-page plan for the British for how to defeat the Americans, which I'm pretty sure is treason. But there it is. And it's some 30 years after the end of the war, they found in the British archive the document that he had given them.
Wow. One viewer would like to know where Conway was from. Where Conway was from.
He was from Ireland.
Ireland, okay. And I think we're just going to end on that. So
Okay.
I want to thank you all for coming out in person,
Thank
and
you.
braving the cold weather. Thank you all for tuning in with us on Zoom. We do have a few copies of his book on the back table here that I know he will be thrilled to sign for you. So thank you again for your support of our mission. We'll see you next time. Take care.